Hello and welcome to this edition of Central Connecticut Now, the program where you get to hear from the newsmakers in our region and the people that cover them for our newspapers. I'm Mike Schroeder, editor and publisher of the New Britain Herald and Bristol Press, and today my guest is Dr. Bill Petit, representative for the 22nd District in the State House, covering Plainville and the west side of New Britain. Bill, welcome.
Thanks, Michael. Thanks for having me.
Congratulations on making it through your first.
Second. So this is the first year of my second term.
First year of the second term.
Yep.
So 3 years total so far.
Yep.
And you're unscathed. You're walking and talking and still literate.
There you go. What would you expect from an old New Britain Herald news carrier?
Oh my, really?
Yeah. Five decades ago.
Everybody's got the Herald in their history somewhere.
Current in the morning, Herald in the afternoon.
Now there's a working man.
Yeah, there we go. we all did it.
Well, tell me, what has been your the biggest learning experience so far in being a state rep? Your first elected position, right?
Correct. There's a lot of policy and procedure to learn.
Yep.
Many of the processes are not straightforward. As the saying goes, people don't want to be in the kitchen when they see the sausage being made. So there's a lot of discussions and a lot of compromise to get things through. But I think just the procedures, having introduced a bill, the chair and the ranking members decide if it's going forward, goes forward, public hearing, vote up or down, or maybe not a vote up or down. If it gets voted up, goes to the House. If it's a House bill, can be brought out to be talked about or just killed by not being brought out, can be brought out and killed on vote, or could win and go to the Senate, and same thing can happen there. So it's a long process to go from concept to get a law passed.
I think one of the things in covering the legislation going through the State House, nothing is ever really finished until the final gavel comes down. You never know where things might reappear.
No, agreed. That's why some people have suggested that we do away with the so-called strike all amendments, where a bill's been passed out of committee and gets to the floor of the House, in my case, and it's got to do with, say, the environment, and someone has another environmental concept and introduces a strike all amendment, that is, take the entire bill out and put a second bill in its place and have people voting on that. So sometimes the titles don't match up what's in the body of the bill, and some people think that's not though it's legal under the regulations, the rules we do go by, a lot of people think it's not an appropriate mechanism because it may not have had a public hearing.
Well, one of the things we see on the national level is between the Republicans and Democrats. It's like a fist fight almost continuously. What have you seen over the last few years in the State House between the Republicans and Democrats?
Well, I think we had probably more compromise in my first term when it was closer, when it was maybe a 4 or 5 vote swing in the House, and the Senate was even. And now that it's like 91-60 and 22-14 in the Senate, I think there's actually been less compromise. They control about 2/3 of the votes.
How do you find is that kind of the environment? Is it that's the kind of feel that you've got, that they know they're in control, so really doesn't matter what you have to say, or is it more of a collegial?
Depends on the issue. Collegial on some issues that people get together on, and where there's issues where you disagree, then yeah, it's very frustrating. The only offense or defense, if you will, that you have when you're in the minority, and it's 2/3, 1/3, is to talk, to introduce amendments, and that's really all you can do. Sometimes if you talk long enough on a bill that is not considered to be critical, it'll be called to pull it from the floor because the leadership wants to move on to other issues that they deem more important.
Do you find that, are there open minds still in existence?
I guess, like your colleagues in the industry and your friends, some people with open minds and some people that have an agenda and they're sticking with it regardless. So, it's hard to generalize. So some open minds and some not so open.
Well, I think it's a good thing to see at least that there are some.
There are some that people that work very well and people you're never going to be able to gain an inch with in a certain area.
How much time do you put into being a state representative?
For the viewers that don't know, in the odd years, like this year on 19, it's a budget year. The budget year goes from basically about the first Wednesday in January to about the first Wednesday in June or so. So it's a solid 5 months and a week or so. And in a budget year, it's big time, full time, especially depending on your committees. There's A committees and B committees. I'm on appropriations, which is a big, busy committee. Public health, which is a big, busy committee, and energy and technology, which is also busy. And I probably was putting in typically 60 hours a week, between being up there and things in district. The non-budget years, next year, the even years, 20, will run from about the first week in February to May, so it's shorter, and you don't have to put together a full budget or discuss all the pieces of the budget, and that I've only done it 1 year before in 18, that tends to be a little bit less time.
Wow. So what were the big issues this year that you had to deal with that took up the time that may or may not have come out, that you may or may not have seen coming out the way you wanted to see them?
Well, obviously, probably the biggest issue that most of the viewers will know about is tolls, which had several public hearings and several committees, and obviously there was a huge grassroots opposition to that. So it has never come forward to the floor of the House and the Senate for a vote. But that was a lot of time and energy in terms of hearing, in terms of speaking with constituents, in terms of meetings outside of the Capitol. Marijuana was sort of in the same area. Marijuana has been brought up in past sessions. There was a lot of talk about it. It was one of the big five that I thought the governor and the Progressive Caucus wanted to pass and never made it past the public hearings and didn't come up for a vote. So there's a lot of time and energy spent on those. Obviously, the budget. We had, as people recall, the very delayed budget in 17 where we passed the Republican budget, I think the first time in the country where a minorities party budget was passed, then vetoed by the governor, and then the compromise budget that went through that I still think was still pretty reasonable budget. Now, this time it was really the governor's budget with some work around the edges by the Democrats. That took a lot of time. Opioids on everybody's mind with over 1,000 overdose deaths, and I think our chair on public health, Representative Steinberg, did a good job in terms we decided we must add 20 or 30 different bills on opiates that came forward, and instead of running 10 or 15 or 20 different bills, we put them all into one bill, the major ideas. So some of the ideas were submitted multiple times. So I think opioids were critical. So I think those were some of the major issues. There's many others as well.
Do you think on all those issues we're going in the right direction?
Well, obviously there's a lot on tolls. I think there's disagreement. The Republicans have put forth a prioritized progress plan that makes use of the grocery receipt tax, gas tax, new car sales tax, et cetera, and bonded money to pay for, to fund the special transportation fund. And other people want to push forward with tolls because they want to get to perhaps 30% of the tolls from people from outside the state. We have a few more hoops to jump through than other states because we've had tolls, took them away. So we have to pass muster with the federal government. We have to have congestion pricing. We can't just place them at the borders. We can't just place them in specific areas. You can place it on a bridge or a specific highway if you use the funds just for that one specific bridge or road. So that is obviously still up in the air. We have not been called back into a special session to vote on it, presumably because there's not enough votes for that to pass. Marijuana, there's a lot of argument about marijuana. From pure, I'm a retired physician. Clearly, from a medical point of view, public health point of view, the negatives outweigh the positives. The people who are for it think it's a relatively benign product and feel that it's going to be legal in the states around us and we'll be surrounded by it, and so people will be leaving the state and it'll create a business flow here. So I suspect that will be back again. I think the watchful waiting, given seeing the experience of Colorado and the missteps and mishaps they're having, and Massachusetts going very slowly with it, I think will be helpful to the state of Connecticut.
Do you think is there any big red flares on that issue in your mind?
Well, I think some of the hidden costs, there's more emergency room visits, for instance, in Colorado, which increases the cost of health care. For people who are susceptible to delusional disorders or psychosis that can be precipitated by some with THC, the active component in marijuana, though obviously in a regulated market that can be adjusted, the amounts of CBD and cannabidiol and the cannabidiols and the THC. And if you precipitate a delusional disorder in someone, that's a major health issue. I believe car insurance is now more expensive in Colorado across the board. I would say the data on fatalities and injuries is somewhat mixed, so I'm not sure there's a clear-cut. I don't think there's a clear-cut pro or con there. One thing a lot of people bring up is the issue of the black market, and the black market seems to thrive in most of the places where marijuana has been legalized because the legal product typically is much more expensive than the black market product. So some people espouse the notion that if you legalize it, you'll suppress the black market, and I don't think that's been the case in other places where it's been legalized. So it's a more complicated issue than at first glance when you look at the data.
And opioids, huge issue. Are we getting any closer to reducing usage, or are we continuing the trend of it being problematic and it being a growing issue?
I'm hopeful that it's at least flattened out in Connecticut and nationwide. I don't know that we've seen a significant decline, especially in Connecticut. I think it's a big part of it is education. A big part of it is education of practitioners. I think the Connecticut State Medical Society and the different subspecialty societies have done and the American Medical Association have a good job educating physicians, where you want people to not knee-jerk a prescription for narcotics for a surgical procedure when perhaps acetaminophen or a non-steroidal, if a person can tolerate it, will do, or other alternatives to pain control. So I think educating the physician population remains critical. Certainly when I started training 40 years ago, physicians were accused on a regular basis of undertreating pain, and that's when pain in the 70s and 80s became the fifth vital sign. And you got the little scale that people are familiar with if they've had a procedure in the hospital, from the crying face to the happy face. And so people were encouraged to treat pain very aggressively, and the pendulum swinging the other way. And I think there's many good things about that. The bad thing about it, I hear from folks in the listening audience, probably as a physician and as a ranking member on the Public Health Committee, is people say, hey, I have X syndrome, X condition, I have cancer, I have this pain, the only thing that works is drug X with oxycodone or hydrocodone or whatever it may be, some form of morphine. Please don't take it away. Or I've gotten calls saying, people say that my physician says that they can't prescribe me as many of these because of the ongoing epidemic, and you've changed the rules. We've tightened the rules on initial prescriptions, especially for kids. But if someone's in need of a narcotic for pain control, if it's documented in the record, if someone needs 60 of a drug a month because they're doing 2 a day, as long as they document in the record they need it for this reason, they're using it appropriately, they're doing well on this, you can prescribe appropriately. So I think some headway. Obviously, the other big thing we've done is made Narcan available, which is our naloxone, the antagonist to narcotics, which is a sort of a stopgap measure. You revive people, live to fight another day. One of the controversial issues that came up this session from a number of people from all over the state was that people are often revived from an overdose of something, say fentanyl, which is the most potent narcotic out there, fentanyl or carfentanil, and they may need several injections, and then refuse medical treatment or assessment, or back on the street and overdose again. In some cases die, and some people have espoused hospitalizing, if you will, against people's will for a certain amount of time, and obviously very controversial given people's civil liberties. It's been tried in other jurisdictions without a lot of good success. So I'm sure that discussion will be had again, trying to keep people from dying out on the streets and trying to protect them while protecting their civil liberties and right to choose what they want to choose, even if it's a bad decision at times.
Wow. Well, are we doing the right thing dealing with the opioids here? I mean, has the state dedicated enough funding to the right efforts to reduce opioid abuse?
Yeah, I think we have in terms of implementation of the naloxone throughout the state and through pharmacies and through public education campaigns through the Department of Public Health, through efforts of the Department of Mental Health and Abuse Services, through or DEMIS, and through DSS. So it's spread through a variety of agencies throughout the state, and I think we were got some federal money for grants that also has been very helpful in terms of programs helping people with their substance abuse and making some of those programs more widely available. So I think we're on the right track, but there's obviously still more to go, because we still may be on a collision course with 1,000 overdose deaths again this year, which, the simple math is almost 3 a day.
Wow.
Throughout the state.
That's a big count.
Yeah, that's a lot of people dying often at a young age.
And we talked about the budget. Are we going in the right direction? Are we improving our situation, or are we kicking the can down the road some more?
Like a lot of things, depends on your viewpoint. In the governor's budget, there is reamortization to get into some of the nitty-gritty of the teacher's pension, and under the previous administration, that was also done with the state employees' pension. And the problem is, it's as when you're at home and you reamortize or refinance your loan, you can lower your payments right now, but it extends your payments. So in this case, this was going to avoid balloon payments, if you will. Our payments going from the $1-2 billion range up to the $5-6 billion range. Our budget's about $20 billion a year, so $6 billion would be almost 30% of the budget. But it's an additional cost. It depends on whose numbers you will, but I think the Secretary of OPM had quoted at the public hearing for appropriations an additional $15.7 billion over 30 years. So some people say, well, we need to do what we need to do to control the payments now so that we can keep doing the programs we need and run the state as we've run it. And other people are in the camp of, I'm not sure this is the best idea to spend another $15 or $16 billion, even if it's over 30 years. And people argue about the time value of money, and it's going to be less than that over time. And it gets into the nuances of, what the worth of money is now versus later.
Well, we've got, you've been through the current term. Any big successes that you're particularly proud of, that are things that things move forward in the state?
I think getting back to opioids, I think the legislation that's been passed over the past 3 years in terms of making naloxone more available, opening up programs, expanding programs, I think have probably been the most successful singular group of legislation that we've done. Depending on, let's see, you know, I've been on public health for 3 years, and there's been a number of small things where we've created better licensing procedures for certain specialties and the like to try to ensure public safety. At some level, it creates more bureaucracy. On the other hand, you need a little bureaucracy to ensure the public safety. But I think the opioids probably has been the biggest issue over the 3 years that I've been there.
Well, let's talk a little bit about some good news about you just coming off the road race, right?
Yep.
And another successful year despite the weather.
Yeah, our 12th annual CHIPS, the third year is CHIPS is the title sponsor for the Petit Family Foundation 5K road race, and it was people recall, it was July 21st. It was a very, very hot weekend where Saturday was really miserable. Sunday started out the same way, but interestingly, we got help from above about 15, 20 minutes before the race. A huge cloud cover came over and blocked the sun and really made it much more tall. A little breeze kicked up. So I think we were in the low 80s, 83, 84 at race time. We had no issues. Nobody went down from heat exhaustion or anything during the race.
That's pretty impressive because it wasn't just the heat. That humidity was going pretty blasting.
Yeah, and I think it really cooled off for about an hour. Cool in the sense that it certainly felt much cooler without the sun beating down on you. So very successful. I think the winning time was around 16:44, 16:45. I think it was in the front page of the Herald or one of the pages. So I'm in the Herald and the Press.
Yeah.
And that was nice. Thank you for that. And so another successful year for the road race. Final numbers aren't in. We'll have them soon when we pay all the bills.
And what are you particularly prioritizing in funding through the foundation now?
Well, again, to remind people or tell them for the first time, we have a complicated mission, which is threefold: the education of young people, especially women in the sciences, help and protect people affected or impacted by violence, and we help with the education of chronic illness. And over the first 12 years of the foundation, those first two, education and helping people affected by violence, has probably been 90+% of our funding. Well, for instance, it happens to be very local. We have just made a 3-year commitment to the Hospital for Special Care. There was state funding, bond money, to put up the inpatient unit for autism spectrum disorders, and we've made a $100,000 grant to the Hospital for Special Care for programming for kids with autism spectrum disorders. We've continued to support Prudence Crandall Center in New Britain, which helps victims of domestic violence, as well as Interval House in Hartford, which is a very large domestic violence center. Well,
thank you for joining us, talking to us about what's going on in Hartford and the great things the foundation is doing.
Thank you, Michael.
Hopefully you'll be here again.
I hope so.
And thank you all for joining us on this edition of Central Connecticut Now. We hope you'll join us for the next edition, where we'll be talking with some of the reporters from the New Britain Herald and Bristol Press about what they're seeing as they cover the news. Thanks again.